Greetings, Brookings Bio students. This is Mrs. Rydell, and we're going to continue with our discussion about Chapter 8, Photosynthesis, and talk a little bit more about some chemical reactions and how we learned about photosynthesis and some of the background and the scientists that help us understand. So let's dust off our bio brains a little bit and remember some of the things that we learned about back in our molecule chapter when we started way back at the beginning of the year. We talked about molecules and we talked about some chemistry and a little bit about chemical reactions. So we're going to kind of review back over that because photosynthesis is a process that involves chemical reactions. And so we're going to kind of refresh our bio brain a little bit. If you remember in our first chapter, we talked about molecules being made out of atoms. Atoms are our smallest little piece of matter, and we said atoms have a nucleus in the center that contains protons and neutrons. If you remember back from our molecule chapter, we talked about atoms. And then the atom itself has also electrons orbiting around the nucleus that are part of that atom in what we call energy levels. We talked about protons being positively charged particles, and neutrons, like their name says, are neutral. Electrons have a negative charge, and that attraction between the pluses of the protons and the negative charge on the electrons is what keeps those electrons orbiting around the nucleus of our atom. We also talked about different atoms, different kinds of atoms, and we talked about a periodic table showing each box showing a different kind of atom and the little chemical symbols that represent atoms. And what makes atoms different from each other is different numbers of protons, neutrons, and electrons. For example, if you look at the table, remember C for carbon, O for oxygen. We talked about phosphorus being P, some different kinds of atoms. What makes the atoms different is how many protons, neutrons, and electrons. And each kind of atom has a different number of protons and neutrons and electrons. So we said we're not going to worry about all the different kinds of atoms, but we kind of zeroed in on atoms that are important for living things. And we talked a little bit about using a symbol, letter symbol, to represent atoms. And we talked also about atoms either gaining or losing electrons. And remember, electrons have a negative charge. So gaining or losing electrons on an atom causes that atom to become what we call an ion. In ions, because they have an electric charge on them, we represent them with their chemical symbol and then a little plus or minus after it. And we talked about sodium, Na is the symbol for sodium, being written when it's in ion form with a little plus next to the letters that stand for sodium. Chlorine becomes an atom. It has tendency to pick up electrons and become more negatively charged. So we write the Cl for chlorine with a little minus symbol next to it. Those two often go together. That's what makes salt, table salt, what you sprinkle on your french fries. We talked about sodium and chloride being important ions for living things. And we learned some symbols for different kinds of atoms that are important for living things. If you remember back from our molecule chapter, we learned C for carbon. Carbon is a really important atom for all life. It's a basic atom that makes all different kinds of molecules found in living things, from DNA to carbs. Proteins have carbon in them. We talked about oxygen being a really important atom for living things. The symbol for oxygen is capital O. We talked about hydrogen. Capital H is the symbol for hydrogen. Those first three atoms on the list as being pretty important components of all the living things, or all the molecules that make up a majority of living things. So the molecules we learned about: carbs, proteins, nucleic acids, lipids, mainly made out of those three atoms: carbon, oxygen, and hydrogen. We also added this atom, nitrogen, and it's for nitrogen. Not all molecules have nitrogen, but it's an important part of, think, nitrogen bases. It's found in DNA and RNA, different nucleic acids. It's found in proteins. And then we also learned symbols for sulfur, capital S is the symbol for sulfur. And phosphorus was our last one. And remember, P is the atomic symbol for phosphorus. And we talked about phosphorus becoming part of a phosphate group that's found in some really important molecules as well for living things. We talked about using atoms now to join together to make molecules, and we talked about joining 2 hydrogen atoms and 1 oxygen atom to make a water molecule. If you remember back from our molecule slideshow, some of these slides are right out of that first chapter that we talked about when we first learned about molecules. And remember I said they're going to kind of keep coming back to haunt you in other chapters. So remember we talked about writing a chemical formula, and basically it's kind of a recipe that tells what kind of atoms and how many are in a molecule. So our chemical symbol, our formula for water is H2O. And what that means is writing a little number 2 next to that H symbol for hydrogen is telling you there are 2 hydrogen atoms. And if we don't see a number after a symbol, that means 1. So 2 hydrogens, 1 oxygen, H2O, makes a water molecule. It's telling you how many and what kind of atoms are in my molecule. We talked also about doing chemical reactions to join different kinds of molecules, atoms together to make molecules. Synthesis reactions are, synthesis means to build or put something together, and we can take smaller pieces and join them together to make bigger molecules. For example, if I take 2 hydrogen molecules and combine them with our 1 oxygen molecule, we get 2 water molecules. Water is made up of hydrogen and oxygen. And when we write a chemical equation that's telling a chemical reaction, we put our reactants on the left-hand side of the arrow, and we put our products, what's produced, on the right-hand side of the arrow. So this little chemical equation here is telling you that if you take sodium hydroxide, which is a base, basically the stuff that we find in oven cleaner, Drano, and combine it with HCl, hydrochloric acid, there's a chemical reaction that happens. That's what that little arrow means. And we get sodium chloride, that's table salt, and water. That's a chemical reaction combining an acid and a base to neutralize each other, and we get salt and water. And remember, reactants on the left side, products on the right. We're going to write some chemical equations on this chapter when we talk about photosynthesis. So we need to kind of refresh our brain about how we write a chemical equation. We talked about chemical reactions needing a little help to get them started. Remember, you got to have that spark from the match to get the fire going. And we talked about it kind of like pushing a snowball up a hill. Once you get to the top, it can roll down all by itself, but it needs a little push to get things started. And all chemical reactions need a little help to get them jump started. We talked about enzymes, proteins found in living things that act as enzymes that can help chemical reactions happen. All of the chemistry that's going on, remember we talked about that word metabolism, all the chemistry that's going on inside your body right now are helped by enzyme molecules that help chemical reactions happen. We talked about the enzyme, and we watched this little animation. This little kind of a lime green blob is my enzyme. And remember we talked about active site, the place on the enzyme where the reaction is going to happen. And our reactant is going to sit in that active site. Here comes our little pink reactant molecule. It's going to sit in the active site and do the reaction, and products are released. We talked about how enzymes work. If you remember, enzymes fit together with their substrates. That's the reactant that they're going to help, like a lock with a key. And each enzyme fits only one substrate, and that little active site is going to be the spot where our substrate is going to sit. And those two together now, remember, enzyme plus the substrate make a complex, a little combination molecule that forms, and then the reaction is going to happen and products are going to be released. And notice my enzyme returns. It's once that helps the reaction happen, the enzyme isn't really changed, and it can help the next molecule again and again and again. Remember, enzymes are reusable. They're specific for the substrate that they're going to help, and they can be used over and over again. So we're going to watch a quick little movie about enzymes.
Here's an example of a chemical reaction. One large compound is broken into two smaller compounds. This reaction takes place much too slowly to be useful in a cell. In order to speed up chemical reactions, cells make special proteins called enzymes. An enzymatic reaction begins when a specific compound binds to an area on the enzyme called the active site. The compound that binds is called the enzyme's substrate. Notice the shape of the substrate and the active site. They fit each other like a lock and key. In general, each enzyme's active site can fit only one kind of substrate, and so can speed up only one kind of reaction. When a substrate binds to the active site, an enzyme-substrate complex is formed. A slight change in the shape of the substrate weakens a chemical bond. This weak bond is easily broken, splitting the substrate into two pieces. The pieces, now referred to as products, detach from the enzyme. In enzymatic reactions, only the substrate is changed. The enzyme itself is unaffected by the reaction. After the products leave the active site, the enzyme is free to speed up another reaction.
Okay, so we're going to go back to our slideshow. If you remember when we talked about enzymes and how they work way back in our molecule chapter, we talked about oftentimes enzyme names end in that ending that we see, ASE, and the beginning of the name of the enzyme kind of tells what it does. So we talked about some examples of enzymes. For example, DNA polymerase, that was our enzyme that we learned about in our DNA chapter that joins the little subunits together to make a DNA molecule. We call that DNA polymerase because it's polymerizing, it's making a polymer. Remember, lots of little pieces joined together makes a polymer. DNA polymerase is an enzyme that joins the pieces to make DNA. We talked about proteases. Proteases are enzymes that work on breaking down proteins, and you have proteases that are working on the food that you had today in your digestive tract. We talked about ATP synthase being the enzyme that synthesizes. Remember, synthesize means to build or put together ATP, and we talked about in our last slideshow about how ATP is our energy molecule, and we're making ATP by joining a phosphate group onto ADP. There's an enzyme called ATP synthase that does that, to add the phosphates on. So we talked about different kinds of enzymes, and we're going to talk more about ATP synthase in this chapter when we talk about how plants use sunlight to make their own food. We're going to stop right there in our slideshow and continue in our next part 2. So stay tuned for more about photosynthesis.